जनता का आह्वान किया, वर्षों जकड़ी बेड़ियों को अब तो तोड़ो। क्रांति की मशाल जला गांधी बोले, अंग्रेजों भारत छोड़ो। बहुत सहा गुलामी को अब ना सहेंगे, आजादी की बात रही वो लेके रहेंगे। अगस्त की बेला में हम सौगंध उठाते हैं, सशक्त राष्ट्र के सपने को चलो मिलकर आज सजाते हैं। हर युवा को रोजगार मिले, हर नारी की आजादी हो, हर घर स्वास्थ्य सबल बने, ये गली गली मुनादी हो।
I'm audible and visible, right?
You are audible, Shruti.
Thank you. Dear listeners, this is Shruti, and I welcome you all for this very exciting conversation on exploring a transdisciplinary approach to public policy implementation. We start this conversation with the premise that service delivery of public goods in India is critical for the well-being of the poor. Despite dedicated efforts made by our young democracy in formulating and implementing pro-poor welfare schemes, multidimensional challenges like paucity of resources, diverse contexts, and lack of accountability and monitoring mechanisms clog the channels of service delivery. To tackle these implementation challenges, public policy practice must borrow from academia. Academics consisting of qualitative and quantitative research methods and conceptual frameworks inform policy practice to specific and general historical, ecological, political, and administrative context in which it is implemented. This leads to contextualized solutions to the immediate and perennial problems of implementation mentioned above. But pressed with deadlines for achieving implementation targets, do practitioners have the bandwidth to borrow from academia, or does academia have the reach to influence public policy practice? To explore these questions, we have with us Soledad Artes-Philemon. Sole is an assistant professor of political science at Stanford School of Humanities and Sciences. Sole's research addresses questions such as what are the political consequences of development and development policies, particularly for women's political behavior? How are minorities, specifically women, democratically represented, and where do inequalities in political engagement persist? And how are voter demands translated in policy and governance? In answering these questions, she relies on mixed methods, including field experiments, survey, and in-depth qualitative fieldwork. Sole also runs a research lab with the goal of pertaining to develop leadership learnings and what works for inclusion and development, called Inclusive Democracy and Development Lab. We also have with us Professor Avanish Kumar, who is the Dean of School of Public Policy and Governance at Management Development Institute. Professor Avanish explores questions at the intersection of policies and practices that promote sustainability, inclusion, and participation in organization and society. Professor Kumar's work revolves around mainstreaming the marginalized through citizen-centric governance, sustainable models of rural livelihood, social entrepreneurship, and designing corporate social responsible practices to promote sustainable partnerships between company and community for long-term solutions. We have Vikram Srinivas as moderator. Vikram is from Bangalore and holds a master's in public administration in international development from Harvard University. He has completed his BTech in electrical engineering from IIT Madras. He's currently living in Delhi and works as a communication professional with the Indian National Congress. He's particularly interested in ways to build social and economic systems which enable people to flourish. Earlier, he has worked with the Accountability Initiative at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, and the Boston Consulting Group in Washington, D.C., and unsuccessfully tried, as he calls it, the civil service exam. He's currently trying to read more books in Indian language. Last but not the least, we also have Anish with us, who is part of the lead team at Transform Rural India. He's a development practitioner. Without further ado, I invite Vikram to start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Shruti. It's great to have a wonderful conversation on a topic which is very important with very distinguished panelists, and I am looking forward to a very interesting conversation. One of the reasons in my brief experience, which I thought that this topic was so interesting, is because looking back at some of the significant development successes which India has had, those have come about because of a fruitful partnership between between knowledge and practice, one might say, or academia and policy practitioners. So if you think about even our statistical system and and the amount of thought and political will which was put into building such a statistical system for a poor country at the time of independence, or even some of our major successes in our development story so far, whether it's the Green Revolution or schemes like Manrega, there's always been sometimes a contested, sometimes cooperative, but always a dialogue between people who are trying to create some knowledge and people who are trying to make some change in the world, whether it be in government or in politics or what today is called the field of policy practice. But it's also very common these days to find that there exists quite a bit of a divide in India between the folks who are in these two worlds. You should speak to academics and bureaucrats who interact a lot with each other. The stereotype, at the risk of generalizing, is that you'll see bureaucrats who say, these academics, they're just too pie in the sky. They lack ground reality. India is a complicated country, and we are the ones who are out there meeting people, doing things, and academics are they have not really an understanding of how a country actually works and how things can be actually done. And on the other hand, if you speak to folks in the academia, they have been burnt often by experiences trying to persuade what seems to be a bureaucrat who has completely made up his mind. And the academics complain that folks who are in policy practice often seem impervious to new ideas, kind of fossilized in a way of thinking, and which perhaps is outmoded and are too resistant to imagining a world which might be different. So this is at least what one encounters as one works in the field of development in India. There is also a challenge of defining relevant theoretical concepts in a country which is as diverse and as rapidly changing as India. This is something which Professor Bhikkhu Parekh noted in the field of political theory in an essay a few decades ago, but which struck me as always being very relevant because, as he says, everything in India is on its way to becoming something else. So how does an academic try and define useful concepts in a rapidly changing environment, especially in a world where a lot of the academia academic might is and resources are concentrated in countries outside India, whether it's especially in Europe and the United States. So the job of somebody trying to create useful knowledge for a practitioner in India is also a difficult one. And one more interesting feature, which I hope we'll touch upon today, is that I've spoken a lot about academia and policy practice, but even the field of who practices policy has grown a lot in the past decade or so. One has management consulting companies, which are increasingly advising governments on all sorts of issues. One has development organizations, which are taking a much more key role in working with governments and trying to shape policy. Governments and NGOs are running fellowship programs by which essentially they're injecting fresh talent into government, even though somewhat on an unstable footing. And large corporations often now have public policy divisions. One can think of most high-profile examples being social media companies, which all now have public policy arms in India, which employ people and try to influence public policy as well. So there is a larger and more emerging kind of field of public policy, which perhaps needs a little bit of thinking through about how the folks in these sectors. I assume that a lot of our audience will either are working or will go on to work in these sectors as well. So that is also another question on how people working in these sectors can think about using knowledge and in a fruitful way as they go about practice. So these were just my kind of experiences as I've been in this field in the past few years. And without saying any more remarks, I'll just throw it open to the panelists to shed light on this interesting discussion. So I thought we could start with just alphabetical order for lack of a better thing to do. So could we start with Mr. Anish, and then Professor Avnish, and then Professor Sol?
Thanks, Vikram. You laid it so well. In many ways, whenever I think of public policy, is something that as citizens of a democratic polity, all of us shape and engage in its delivery. I guess here we are talking of people and someone like me who has taken on this as a profession, not as just as a citizen. And in some ways, whenever I think of public policy, I see it as what you would typically call these days the wicked problem. It involves complex interdependent issues. Origins are very difficult to figure out. They don't have clear solutions. And if the solutions exist, we often miss the unintended consequences. And while we seek solutions to sticky problems, like in our work, say learning outcomes in rural schools, or challenge of undernutrition, or even simple things like getting our public hospitals, not beyond delivering healthcare, just having a normative impact on a sense of social sense of hygiene. It's very difficult to implement them, and because they have multiple origins, multiple linkages, and in the last few years, more and more, we have talked about things like behavioral nudges, change communication, and such things. But in my own experience, I have found self-explanation as a very critical anchor of being a development professional, or you could say a public policy practitioner. This required me to delve into those primordial questions like what makes us human, what makes us part of a community, why is society unequal, what makes us behave in a particular way. And this got me to explore various origins which transcended philosophy, psychology, evolutionary neuroscience, economics, to understand what makes us what we are. And as a practitioner, this kind of a transdisciplinary view with the intersections that exist in a very natural way, and to make a sense of the whole, the gestalt, and the world around us answering, and in many ways, for me, if I were to reflect, it answered questions related to self-efficacy, answering questions, why I am here, why I am doing what I am doing. And it gave me some sort of a conviction and anchorage to connect my tasks to a deeper purpose. And that, I think, is very critical as development professionals to, in our everydayness of work, to explore and build on. So in this context, when I looked at the duality of, or perceived duality, let me put it like that, between academia and practice, it does seem very odd. Because as a practitioner, sense making is contingent on understanding of what is around me. So theoretical frameworks, the rigor that academia offers is essential. And not just for advancing understanding, but also understanding the realities, the analysis of the complexities around me as a professional. And particularly in context of India, where we have, you referred to both the cultural dynamics and the high context society that we are, a very empathetic toggling between the theory and practice is what would make us effective. In our work at TRI, very early on, we realized for us to be successful or create impact, we need to draw academia to our work and create meaningful platforms for dialogue and collaboration. And I'm very happy that two people whom I admire a lot are on our panel today, and we are having formal engagement in our diverse work. This allows for a continuous and dynamic interaction, which solely the work that we are doing brings in theoretical research linked to practical implementation. And I guess when we deal with the wicked problems of public policy, we'll need this kind of a transdisciplinary approach, drawing academic insights and practical, you could say, expertise or evidences to converge and create a meaningful impact. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anish. Professor Avnish.
Yeah. Thank you, Anish Bhai, and thank you, Vikramji, and Shruti, and of course, other panelists. It's my pride to be here. Very quickly, I think many things are already said, but few things which I would like to add upon. Let's say make it simplistic for which I see young, maybe interested policy and development practitioners who might be listening to us. Technically speaking, it's very important to simplify the semantics in public policy. What I believe is that there is so much of inconsistency of interpretation, and this ambiguity is infused largely by academicians because it also elevates their position. So if I make it very simple for today's discussion, that what I have understood about public policy, in a very simplistic term, public policy is a purposive statement, which is expected that all the actors will align with. Now, taking into this consideration, now why the policy has a challenge. Now, policy, public policy I'm talking about, not policy per se. Largely, if you see, when it comes to state, it has two very, what Anish Bhai was talking about, wicked problem. I think the wicked problem in policy design are twofold. One is about the risk appetite of the government to mitigate the resource scarcity with the rising demand. And I'll give you one example for many audience who is here. Way back in early 1912 or 13, don't remember exactly the year, Mr. Gokhale presented compulsory and elementary education. And if you read the writings of Madan Mohan Malviya, the point of contestation by the opposition was same which happens today. And you see what we have today as a challenge. If imagine India had compulsory education in 1912, India would have been very different. So whatever we have talked about, the way we started video today, like we talked about Azadi, but if you really go by the freedom and choice which Amartya Sen talks about, we might have got political and administrative autonomy and freedom. But if you look at medical poverty, if you look at educational poverty, poverty is infused by the lack of access and utilization of public services. So I would say the one challenge is about how to overcome this wicked problem of limited resource, because India is above all a poor country. I mean, India is the poorest country in G20. Now, managing such kind of humongous target is a difficult, but still there are innovative solutions which can be provided. The second thing is that policy making is also a political statement. Now, what do I mean by political statement is not politicians. Now, in order to arrive at consensus, and there are ample literature also and evidence also in this, there is a strategy to actually incorporate ambiguous terms within the policy statements. What do I mean by ambiguous for the listener? Let's say I say sustainable. Now, I'm not saying sustainable is bad, but sustainable word or sustainability can absorb anything and everything, including sustainable relationship. Now, how do we actually overcome that? Mr. Parshwan was talking about that. Let's come up with some, terms which gives direction to us on the ground. And I tried this long back with the support of Ford Foundation on one aspect of it, because this was one of the most debated, and this was one of the questions which I had, that what does women empowerment mean to our women worker on the ground? Basically trying to test in Bihar, the Jivika women who are working SHGs. And I was asking them, and these are all Western literature. So time is limited, but what I realized that for our role women, basically income is only one component of it. But the rise of identity is equally important to reduce the insecurity. And that is what one constructed the idea of empowerment. Why I'm saying this? Because I started my career with development sector, which Anis Bhai knows about it. So, on ground, when you work as a youth, there is a lot of passion to make a change. But I am confused, what do I do with it? Because I am not getting a direction. With these words which are bombarding my mind, I really get confused with my energy, and such things are very difficult. So I think there are two things which needs to be sorted here. Now comes the issue of policy making. Sometimes we see policy making as a very homogeneous category of public policy. Many people who are working on public policy, and including the speakers here, Anis Bhai will certainly agree with me, policies are not influenced by what is gathered, but policies are largely influenced by what is not gathered. Why I'm saying this? There I see the role, sorry though I'm not asked for, but my advice to TRI with the kind of cranial capacity they have and experience, getting data and bringing a kind of a palette or a bouquet of data for policy making might be a very costly affair for the NGOs, because NGOs don't get that kind of fund. But certainly becoming a kind of a critical solution provider to fill the gap or bridge the gap between theory and practice, that is a niche area which I don't see much of the NGOs anywhere. I have not seen much. I have worked in South Asia also, where NGOs are being able to, because governments certainly do not have the ability to get into them. So I think that is a niche area which one can think of looking at the policy as a design. Now, when we look at policy, what to achieve, now what happens is that when the government is making a statement, it is also about the winnability. Like you talked about MG and RAG. Now, if you segregate MG and RAG, the way I understand, with SRLM or NRLM, one could be classified as wage distribution and one as a wage creation. Now, these two strategic mix is important for any livelihood change. So why can't we look at convergence between these two, whereby, because for a person who is there in the ground, maybe in Andhra Pradesh or anywhere in the world, the challenges are not like SRLM and RLM and others. I mean, it's a challenge of humanity which takes into play. So this is the one part which I thought I'll talk about this. Now, Mr. Vikram was talking about partnership. I did a study for Amit Chandra Foundation for Maharashtra government on DCLT program, which is basically, and this paper has also come in EPW. Like, I was trying to understand what is the structure which promotes partnership between the state and non-state actors. And therefore, I thought maybe people read or not, but even the title should influence that. My understanding says that I have titled it as Mutual Strain and equitable gain. Now, what I am saying is, if I and Anis Bhai do not understand our strain, and that realization will only bring us together. When we come together, then often when there is lack of due acknowledgement, or what you call as substantive equality or equitable justice, with the kind of contribution you make, the partnership collapse. So I believe if there is a realization, maybe I'm a bureaucrat, politician, development expert, or an academia also. Now all of us are living and loving our echo chamber. Now we are not realizing our strain, that whatever we are bombarding to our students, they are also not enjoying. Maybe they are respecting on the face of it, but ultimately not gaining any outcome out of it. So I think till all of us realize our strain of the limitations and the strength which partner brings it, this partnership will not work. This will only be desired as a normative position, but it will never work. This is what my understanding is. Second thing is the structure is also not there. Like suppose when last week I was there in the program of TRI, you feel good to see such kind of students also who are desiring to make a change, which is very rare today. I mean, like most of the students would like to work in AC and that is not bad. But if you have to work hard, you have to go on ground, you have to deal with people, then there are several challenges which you have to take care of. Now, when I look at NGOs, because nothing against NGOs, but what I look at NGOs, the one thing which I see as a challenge, if I were a bureaucrat or if I were a decision maker, now NGOs are such a heterogeneous community, because I see many NGOs who do good work, but they cannot write. Those who write may not do good work. So who brings this together? Now that there are very few TRI in India, as far as I understand, whatever limited knowledge I have. Now this disjoint between this heterogeneous group, maybe with the same objective, is itself a problem. And certainly we are not Europe, France, or maybe Germany and America, where a bureaucrat can come from Sciences Po and then go for 2 years education, come back. This system in India, though we have started with internship. So I think this is one of the structural problem of not having a kind of. My thinking is that whatever I would, and then I'll stop. If there is a question, then I can take it further. That the biggest challenge, be it in government or private sector, or I'm talking about even business and NGO, is the accountability is not very well established. And when I say accountability, top-down accountability, vertical accountability is well established. I'm accountable to Anis Bhai, and Anis Bhai takes it further. But if you look at accountability as an ecosystem, the biggest issue, even for a politician, is accountability to self. That is that I am, with my ability to live with my choice and freedom, with a moral accountability, or whatever term you may coin it, that I take, which is in the interest of the public, which I'm working for. Institutional accountability are quite well established, what I have to do, what not I have to do, and all these factors which are required. Now, when you do not have this accountability to self, the relational accountability breaks, the give and take. When I am in the village, I may be corrupt in terms of my underperformance. So I think I would say that, ultimately the governance of development sector needs, and even education, by the way, needs much more deliberation to make a change in the policy as far as an actor who is not within the government. Because I believe the governance in India, even in education, in higher education, like any other university you may count, JNU, DU, and so forth, the governance is not equipped with such kind, and neither I see many development organizations are. Because if you really have to have some kind of legitimacy in the society, it requires lot many things, be it the governance strategy or marketability, also in terms of livelihood, that results into some form of acceptance in the society, which makes more legitimate as far as my presence is concerned. The last thing, and then I conclude, is that with the rise of CSR and declining of government resources to the development sector, I think because I'm in a business school now, and when I see this, there is a gap between what we call as scale, speed, and scope. Anyone who has given life in village to make the lives of million people's change in the life of their million people they will be afraid to speak on. They may be very hesitant and they will feel that they have challenged their own morale by showing. But what to do with that? I mean, the outside world is asking for change, let's say 20,000 villages, 30,000 villages. So that is the trick. I mean, how do we bridge this gap? The demand who is being funding basically for is asking for speed, scale, and scope, which is very different with the attitude of development practitioners. At least people who have worked for 30, 40 years, who are basically leading the organization. So that is something which I'll stop it here. Public policy should not be seen as a government statement. I think public policy should be seen in line with an arrangement of public action. And I think when public action is oriented, because in these days, if you see demos prudence, and that is the judiciary interventions, there are many policies which are actually, what we need to do is to bridge the gap between state and society. And that's what is required. So I'll stop it here. Thank you so much for giving me a privilege to be here.
Thank you so much, Professor Avnish. Professor Solé.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to be on this panel, to be sharing with all of you, and to be amongst everyone here. So thank you so much for having me. My comments are going to pick up on many of the things that have been said, and particularly the things that Professor Avnish said about partnership. And so I thought I would use just a few minutes to share a bit about my personal experience working on collaborative research projects in India, but from the perspective as an academic from the US. And to give just a little bit of background on that, for the past decade, I've been working with NGOs, with government partners to understand how policy implementation can improve the lives of women in rural India. And this has involved the most extreme version of academics sitting at their desks, me as an academic sitting at my desk studying existing data and trying to develop learnings, mostly without stepping foot in the country. That was mostly the COVID era of the last decade. It's involved what I would call a more typical model of academics who provide basic inputs directly to partners without a lot of back and forth. I've also had the opportunity to be involved in much more in-depth partnerships, multi-year partnerships that have been able to build new knowledge bases that have been much more collaborative. And now, as Anish mentioned, really trying to innovate and think through how you actually build a deeply collaborative partnership aimed at integrating academia and practice, and think through how do we create bidirectional learning. And so I think I've seen a little bit of all of the good, the bad, and the ugly of academic and practitioner relationships. And in all of this, Shruti started us with a question of, is it possible for policy to be informed by academia, and is it possible for academia to influence policy? And my conclusion from all of this is that, yeah, it is, yes, but it often involves a lot of pain points. And those pain points are often because these two institutions are often working in isolation and then using our own learnings and knowledge to try and force our square blocks into each other's round holes. And so I thought I would think through, where have I seen the incredible opportunities for this? But then more deeply explore the challenges, and then leverage some of these newer collaborations that I have found to be very fruitful to think through maybe prospects for the future and for where we can move forward in answering some of the questions that Professor Avnish put forward as to what could partnership look like. And so when I think about opportunities, one of the things that is really striking to me, particularly about working on research in India, is that there is in India an incredible thirst for knowledge and learning, and an incredible thirst for partnership. I sit in a department with people who study the entire globe, where there are a lot of people, for example, who study the US and how do we improve policy outcomes in the US. What I can tell you is that the number of collaborations that involve partnerships for those who study, for example, the US and Europe, are close to zero. Most of the learning about the global north is what we would think of as the typical academic approach, where academics sit at their desk and learn and then share outward. And when I think about the community of scholars and practitioners that I engage with in the study of policy implementation in India, it's a fundamentally different approach where there is a thirst for engagement, a thirst for this bidirectionality. And so I actually think that this is, we've spent a lot of time thinking about the pain points, and we'll continue to explore these. But I actually think that the topic of this panel around how you create transdisciplinary partnerships, I think this is where India has a unique opportunity to inform the rest of the world on how to do this effectively, because I think we see more examples of that kind of effective partnership in this context than we do elsewhere. I also think that, as has been raised, there are a lot of challenges in thinking through how you navigate complex and rapidly changing environments, but this opens up a lot of opportunities for open questions and for new and innovative policy that opens up space for learning. And given that India is a regularly changing landscape, that actually allows, at least from the academics' perspective, a huge set of opportunities to come in and learn about how things change and how things work. And so I think that this is a space where I really hope we can make traction on the questions of the panel. But maybe what is more sort of pressing is thinking about the challenges and how we navigate those. And so there's numerous challenges, many of which have been raised, but a few that I wanted to elevate. One of the things that has come up is that timelines are often at odds with each other. Academic research takes a long time to get to learnings, but practice requires rapid implementation and responsiveness to the on-the-ground needs. At the end of the day, we are talking about engaging with real people whose lives, have immediate needs, and academics don't necessarily move at paces that are relevant for that or as optimal. I think another challenge is that research often requires, or at least requests, simplicity. How do we understand how do we get to the core of things? How can we simplify and make parsimonious models? And yet successful practice often requires complex interventions. How do we recognize that the challenges on the ground are complex? They require interventions at multiple different points. And so if you have this need for complexity and yet a demand for simplicity, that can create an incompatibility. And then more generally, what I think this speaks to is that incentives are often misaligned, where we're not even talking about the differences in incentives between the practitioner and the academic. And so I wanted to explore these incentives more explicitly and think through where those misalignments might be, but also where we can then think about how you align those incentives. I have an economics background and training. And so much when we think about the answer to the question of what is effective policy, it's often how do you align the incentives, of the policymakers with the citizens themselves. And I think some of that learning can help us in how you align the incentives of the academic with the practitioner as well. And so to me, where I'll go ahead and give my conclusion in all of this, but then explore these misalignments very briefly. My conclusion is that true co-creation between practice and academia is what's critical to understand and be able to have dialogue around incentives, but also to understand, to learn optimally. And that means that knowledge should not just flow from academia to practice, but should be bi-directional. But this requires a few things. The first thing it requires is finding projects and collaborations that are incentive compatible from both perspectives. And so a few misalignments that I see regularly and engage with myself. So when we think about the incentives of a practitioner are often to carry forward fundable and scalable policies that will have an impact. Whereas the fundamental incentives of academics are to get publications out. Now, both of those are with the aim of how do we, make improvements on social problems, but the mechanism to doing that is very different. I think, and I'll speak more from the academic perspective, so I'll be curious for others, and particularly Anish, to articulate where I get the practitioner perspective wrong. But I think one of the goals of the practitioner is to answer the question of how do we solve social problems in feasible ways? And I think the goal of the academic is slightly different. How do we understand the root of social problems such that we can then design different solutions in different contexts? I think there's differences in approach. I think the practitioner knows the ground with a deep understanding of the complexities and the context. And that's come up in this conversation. And I think the approach of the academic is often one of abstraction. How do we think about taking cases and abstracting them, simplifying them so that we can understand their component parts and therefore get to a more general theory of the roots of social problems? And all of these sort of reveal the fundamental tensions of academia and practice together. But I think that this is where co-creation can really help in both creating dialogue between these, but also in recognizing that an answer to policy implementation requires both sets of approaches, and that both sets of actors have something fundamental to bring to these tables. And so I wanted to just conclude very briefly, and then I'd be curious to discuss all of this and much more in the Q&A, but conclude briefly with how I think this could happen. And I think the first thing it requires is an approach that involves humility that is often uncharacteristic of academia. A humility in that this needs to be bi-directional, that learning needs to flow in both directions, and that it is critical to integrate multiple voices. The foundation of the research that I do is thinking about inclusion in development and in democracy. And I think that this is yet another space where inclusion and integration of multiple voices is going to make us all better. And one thing we know is that the more you can integrate voices from the ground, the more effective the learnings will be at actually solving the problems that we care about. But also, I think it's important to acknowledge that academics have an important set of skills as well to bring to the table and to integrate. And I think one of those, in addition to the technical skills that academics train for, I think one of the key roles that an academic can play is as a disruptor, a challenger, someone who forces a questioning of existing presumptions. I'm reading a book right now on how our medical knowledge, this book is medical knowledge around pediatrics, for example, how much of this knowledge was shaped in the past by practice and critical moments where practice needed an answer. And later academic studies have fundamentally disproven many of those things. And so there is, I think, a value in making progress and then sort of challenging those presumptions. But at the end of the day, I think it really comes back to both institutions working in tandem and recognizing the added value that comes from each. And, again, as the academic, as an academic, I wanted to bring some of the research we have on some of these things. And one thing we know and have substantial research on is that greater diversity in decision-making spaces improves outcomes by ensuring that multiple perspectives filter to the top and that only the best ideas succeed. We have so much evidence that greater diversity in corporate boards increases innovation and therefore business output. We know, for example, in political spaces that greater diversity amongst the political cadre leads to better and more diverse policy options. And I think that this is fundamentally true of the academic practitioner partnership, that having the diverse set of voices at the table that come from this, instead of trying to force everyone to have the same incentives, allowing everyone to bring their different perspectives and incentives, but then hash those out in conversation and dialogue, seems to be the biggest opportunity emerging for this kind of partnership through true co-creation and to elevate the voice of both. Now, I'm not going to say that this is an easy thing to accomplish. It's something that, I think that we're still developing lots of models for, and I think there are lots of models to turn to in this, but that I think is where it would be interesting to dialogue and learn is how do you ensure that we actually have these dialogues, not just at a high level like we're having now, but integrated and fundamental as every component of research and practice. So I'll stop there, but looking forward to engaging and learning from everyone else here.
Great. Thank you so much. That was an incredibly rich set of remarks from all three panelists. I think we heard suggestions about everything from the attitude of oneself as an individual in terms of humility or accountability or living with your own moral choices, and all the way up to large socioeconomic systems and how we need diversity. So we've got, I think, about 25-30 minutes of to just perhaps discuss between panelists, following which we can have 15 minutes or so of Q&A. So I'd urge the audience, if you have any questions about either what the panelists have said so far or about any of the 20-25 minutes of ongoing discussions, to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screens to ask questions. And we can take those up when we open for questions in 20 minutes. So one thing I think which I heard, which all three of the panelists emphasized on, was the importance of dialogue in kind of an open and humble way, where both parties, or as many parties as there might be, bring their strengths to the table and recognize that, of course, different people do have different strengths. So, I mean, how would one try and start incorporating this kind of a systematic dialogue more as a rule rather than an exception? Because my experience, and perhaps the more experienced folks will disagree with me, but my experience is that these dialogues happen, once in a year, once in a couple of years for most people, and tend to involve one subset of actors who are able to reflect and who are able to speak, but perhaps doesn't draw as widely as it should. And I'm not even talking here about dialogues between practitioners and academics, but even the dialogues between practitioners themselves are rarely very representative, at least in the Indian context. So I recall, for example, a conference I attended at a very fancy hotel in New Delhi on urban governance, which had a very star-studded panel and lots of sessions, a whole day discussion, with the small problem that there was not a single officer who worked in the municipal council or a mayor or anyone who actually, a councillor or anyone who has actually run anything in urban governance represented in that room. And this, I think, this is just a practitioner problem too, because there's lots of hierarchies in how the Indian state is structured. So I thought we could spend some time usefully discussing how does one go about creating these kinds of structures where open dialogue happens at scale? Are there examples you've seen, either bright sparks, either here in India or elsewhere in the world, which we can try and draw from? The floor is open to anybody who wants to speak.
I'm happy to jump in unless others have thoughts. And I'll take this opportunity to share a little bit about a partnered project I have right now with Anish and TRI, as I think it has taught me some of how you can create this open dialogue, at least from the academic practitioner lens. And I think there's more to your question that I'll come to at the end, of the multiple stakeholders involved, because right now I've at least spoken a lot about the two sets of stakeholders, in the room, but there are many people not in the room that we need to also think about. But, I want to share a little bit that we have a project right now trying to understand how you better incorporate women's voices into local policy making in rural India. And this is something that builds on that I think is critical for a larger set of academic and knowledge building institutions that think about how, not just what is representation, but how do you achieve the multiple dimensions of representation, but also has fundamental, I see as aligned with some of the fundamental policy demands on how do we make sure and most effectively ensure that women's voices are reflected in policy making. And I think about how did we create this dialogue? I'll be curious for Anish's perspective, but I remember what was it, 2 years ago in October, us sitting in a room for like 6 hours, just talking, starting a conversation around what are some of the biggest challenges and social problems and facing India, what are the things that TRI is trying to accomplish, what are the things that puzzle my brain, and spending a long time sitting together and hashing out ideas and really, back and forth, the number of different ideas that came up and emerged from both sides. And then in that conversation around, oh, well, what if we tried, like, what if policy looked like this? Well, this would be the problem with implementation. And what if it looked like this? And how do you solve it? And that to me was the spark and the start, not of the relationship, but of this project through that dialogue. And maybe that looks like what you're talking about, Vikram, this once a year. But I think what looks different from this is that we've continued to have that dialogue throughout. And that project now exists out of that conversation. We co-wrote grants together. We've co-written and co-presented parts of that work. We're now actually working on it. And to speak to what is different about that project from other research projects I've done in the past, where maybe you have one conversation and then the academic goes one way and formulates a plan and then passes it off and the practitioner implements it. And we only dialogue at the beginning and at the end. I think what looks different is we now have a weekly conversation where the details of the project are hashed out every week. And now the number of stakeholders involved in that conversation is larger. In fact, our weekly conversation, I think now has something like 12 people who show up regularly to dialogue on the challenges that are being faced. And I think all that has meant, just to speak to this very briefly, all that has meant is typically I would have a weekly conversation with the research team. It's meant opening up that space. And I imagine that there would be a weekly meeting on the practice side. Instead of seeing these as two distinct institutions doing different things, where each has expertise in a specific area but can't inform the other, it simply meant taking those spaces that already exist and combining them. And the amount of knowledge that has flown between the two, I think this project is going to be one of the most effective that I've seen, because the dialogue is happening in regular space. So that at least speaks to the part of the conversation about how at least I have observed personally some opportunities for open dialogue. Of course, there's a lot still left on the table as to, what more could be done and how to integrate this, but I thought I'd share that perspective.
Vikram,
Yes.
Solen, and this is, the wavelength matched and it resonated so much. And obviously, a relationship which preceded this conversation made that possible. And you are very special that way in listening to practitioners, woes and perspectives and issues and what we continue to do. So you helped us succeed there. I am reminded of a very interesting work, Vikram, that even today is the richest set of academia practice work around cooperatives. Tushar had initiated at IRMA. It was a long study, and it was a longitudinal, I think about 6 years, where he used the faculty and students going for their industrial training. And I think some of the programs that we now have, which are more applied in nature, like business management, which have these spaces. But if we build it in a longitudinal manner, a lot of structured response can happen. At TRI, we have been exploring it with few universities. We haven't been very successful, but doing these was the points that both Avinash and Sole said. The challenge of misaligned incentives, the challenge of time horizons, the challenge of relational autonomy, absence of relational autonomy. We'll have to figure out spaces that do that. The second I'm reminded of, I was interacting, I don't see that much in India. Maybe the Project Unnati that this government had started, maybe it was like that. I'm reminded of experience at the Central American University in Nicaragua. They have a very large development project anchored by Nit Lapan. is just like a development NGO, and which has multiple, it has a very large microfinance program, micro enterprise development program, and there is a very structured learning built in. We did borrow that in our university education, be it in agriculture or in other disciplines, but we haven't, I don't know other than Tushar's work, which informed practitioners like us, even today continues to inform practitioners like us, but maybe we can explore some of that.
Thanks, Professor Avnish. I think you're on mute, sir.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I think a lot of has been already shared on dialogue. Personally, I feel that there would be no one who will be in opposition of need for dialogue. However, we are not able to reach out to dialogue which is fruitful. I mean, like fruitful in the sense which can make change. Now, my thinking is that, what happens that how do we make, I'm talking about fundamental challenge of dialogue, like how do you make a plural of anecdotes, which is like opinion, in a reasoned or scientific argument? When I say scientific, not I mean by science or lab-oriented science, which is self-repetitive fact. And bit of it, what I have learned, whether it is to Sarsa's initiative or others also, many times dialogues are restricted to opinions and personalities, whereas dialogues are fundamentally to share perspective and to arrive at some common ground of thinking. My thinking would be that this might be a challenge, but this is desired. So I think that if, and frankly speaking, with I see the rise of social media, where whether it is called as monologue or dialogue, but if you see the exchange of tweets, LinkedIn, and so forth, there is an interest and energy for dialogue. Now, our challenge is that we are not able to mainstream that, and that's the biggest challenge. Now, how we can do it, I believe, there is a need to have a dialogue, which are intergenerational dialogues. And at an equal platform. I'm not saying that I am professor, so I should sit on a table and rest on, so follow me. What is happening is that many of us are living in echo chambers of dialogue, because I am here to elevate my position and I'm thinking of how to make it something is in line with my thinking. So I personally feel that there are two challenges, because you will agree with me, policy has two fundamental challenges, like how do you categorize that problem? And when we discuss, let's say, with people who have grassroots experience, every problem as a humanistic argument is different problem. Let's say poverty at different places, it might be different. But for a policymaker, one has to conceptualize poverty as a category. Now, that's the challenge between micro and macro. How do we merge these two? I do agree that there are platforms and that they help, and there are challenges of incentive. Like, I'll be very honest what Professor Atis said. In my issue, it does not matter how much dialogue I do. It only matters how much I publish. So I think about publishing, and that too in ABDC category. But I will make one statement, which I think many academicians will agree, including my panelist. For faculties also and academia, there is an inherent, I would say, latent representation of students that what we are speaking is irrelevant to them. Now, we are very much away from the reality. What I mean to say is, this teaching today, contemporary teaching, is not about knowledge and understanding, because Google and ChatGPT gives you enough knowledge and understanding. Current teaching is about realization, and where I think the TRI kind of organization is best suited as a lab, real life laboratory. So I think that is the place of, if you're talking about dialogue which results into realization and change, I think that is because classes are becoming very boring. If you see at the face of the students, they say very politely that you please go now, it's over, I'm tired. So it is basically, and I'm being very honest with all of you that, we also face this. So And it's very humiliating because you think that you are a good teacher, and at least you think so. But at the end of the day, that's the message you are getting. So I would say the audio video media has become so powerful tool of learning. And how, let's say concept of a woman's voice in policy making. If I want to search, let's say 6 to 7 minutes, let's say audio video, do I have one which I can, let's say, present in class and make a kind of systematic understanding about that? I may not have one. So I think there is a need to create ground knowledge for the policy making in a way it can be absorbed to the policymaker, because our knowledge are not in a usable form if we are talking about policy making, because we may be writing for ourselves, but they require a very different language. And lastly, sorry, Vikramji, you come from political background also, but I have not seen, and I'll not hesitate to say that, any politician taking any decision if they don't elevate their positions. They take a decision which actually elevates their position. So are we making knowledge which elevates their position? Academia may be not thinking about political win, but they have to think of it. Then only there will be a policy change. I'll stop it here. If there are other questions, then I'll take it.
Thanks. Also a wonderful response. Just diving into this the bit on dialogue a little bit further. Professor Avnish, I think you were hinting at in your call to make dialogue fruitful is well taken, and I'm sure we can all recall dialogue which has felt a little boring or purposeless, whether in an academic setting or even in a conference or any other kind of a collaborative environment. But circling back to something which Professor Sole was talking about, often it is that the incentives are misaligned. So even if you say as academics, let us, we think we have done something useful in a somewhat collaborative way. Let's try and now expose it to a larger audience. And I don't know, maybe you hold a conference, maybe you do make a 5 or 6 minute video like Professor Avni suggested, and then you try to get in, an audience of, let's say, a few bureaucrats, a couple of politicians, some media folks, a bunch of practitioners. But how do we make that dialogue fruitful if everyone's incentives are misaligned? And one element in what I think emerged in Professor Avnish said was that even the knowledge which you're trying to create ought to be useful for the interests of the different people over there. But similarly, I would guess that even the actions of the other stakeholders, whether it's a bureaucrat or a politician, even that has to be compatible with academic interests, right? It can't be that I publish research and then it is just taken and it disappears without people ever finding out what happened to it. So how does one, if the fundamental problem is trying to make that dialogue fruitful, and one of the roadblocks is the incentives, because if my incentives don't match, why would I talk? So how do we break this kind of chicken and egg problem where I can't create a common understanding unless we talk, and I don't talk because right now there's no, our incentives are all different. So how does one go about challenging this situation?
Can I attempt this?
Yes. Please, go ahead. Yes, Professor Avnish.
See, there is also a caste system in academia. And let's say about myself. Now, I'm not going to get any promotion. I'm already a professor. Now, when you are assistant and associate, the drive for publication, because it's also accumulation of papers. It's not merely about how much you make a change and so forth. If you see the history of academia, most of the authors and maybe people whom we quote from their books. And there used to be a time when this gestational period of books may come in 20 years, 30 years of their work, 40 years of their work. Now it comes in, let's say, 2 years, 1 year, even 6 months and 3 months also, because writing a book also gives you an incentive. What I'm trying to say is, maybe for assistant and associate level professor, the development sector provides a very good lab to collaborate and maybe also write a scientific paper and also convert it to a policy paper or white paper, which I think. Whereas for a professor who has become once a professor, then there is always a desire to contribute because one has achieved certain kind of salaries and also positions, and there is no further promotion which may actually require certain. Of course, there is a need for publication, but you need more of some kind of incentive. I would say purposive incentives in terms of contributing to make change. So I think it is not that professors are not looking for good knowledge hubs or source of knowledge. They are looking for it. Maybe this gap can be bridged. I also feel that there are very few development sector who has ability to bridge that. So it's a very niche area. So if there are organizations like TRI, I think that is the ability when one can bridge gap for, because doing research in India, and I'm being, my two brothers, like one who's already settled in US, their research funding is not like what we have. We have to plan our output before we get the funding. We have to plan our transport, travel, everything which is calculated. So in this meager opportunity of resource funding, it's largely a matter of resource investment and resource efficiency, which you get in Indian academia. So why not, there is already a demonstrated experience which can be utilized in collaboration with young development experts working on ground, and both of them come together and they articulate paper. In fact, if you see any good paper, there is a realism in it, because any abstract paper only can make a very pure science argument. But when it comes to development sector and policy making, which is more anthropocentric than anything else, this requires realism. So that is a good area where we can converge, and that can be a very good dividend for both the sectors.
I'll pick up Avinash sir on this. See, the way we have structured TRI, one of our practice verticals is actually called a lab, which we call Community Action Lab. So now I get from both Soleil and you, we need to offer this as a place for both academia and research partnership, and the points that you highlighted. So it is a challenge on our part also to articulate exciting, real, issues for academia to be interested or research scholars to be interested in it. So I will pick it up as a very important element for our work on community action labs. So thank you very much. So there is a very concrete thing that I take from this conversation today.
And if I can build on this, I wanted to actually pick up on the first point that Avnish made, which is about the stages, how incentives change across the professional life cycle. And I wanted to push even further and encourage practitioner organizations to work with students, particularly PhD students, who where I actually think the incentives are closer aligned. They have very few years to get things out, so their time horizons are much shorter. And I think about my own career, which still is nascent, and has I still exist under some of these incentives, but where I owe my career to the organizations that worked with me when I was a student. I wouldn't have gotten the job I wouldn't have the opportunities I have to continue to build this work had those opportunities not been made for me. And so I think I want to elevate that suggestion, but I also want to highlight that in a world as an academic where publication is the only real incentive we have, I think that also reveals the power of the practitioner, that practitioners hold a huge amount of authority in enabling that, in being, we can't publish if we have nothing to study or no opportunities. And so, Anish and others, when thinking about this, I think it's important for the terms of those partnerships to be set out from the beginning and to be, not just where the academic says, here's what I want to do, let's make it happen, but where there is an articulation of what is valuable and what is required on the side of the practitioner. And that can be, where I've seen incentives start to meet. For example, is when an academic says, okay, I need to do this big study, it's going to take 3 years. That's a long time. Here's what here's what it's going to look like. Here's the outputs. But because I recognize that knowledge needs to be generated faster, every 3 months, I will provide a new policy brief or report or more rapid piece of learning that can be more responsive to the needs on the ground. I think there are ways to find that, those compatibilities more. The very last thing, though, that I want to say in all of this is that in figuring out how you build this incentive compatibility across life cycles, I'm realizing my thought may have just floated out of my brain. So I think I'll actually just stop there, but suggest that, oh, the last thing I wanted to say is something that builds on what Vikram shared, which is that I think that, at least for me, someone who is in the profession of academia, because I care deeply about the work that I do and the social problems that I attempt to tackle, I think that's a fairly common experience, the passion for what we do. One of the biggest fears we have is that we're speaking into the ether, that the work that we're doing has no impact on the world. And I think that that's something that building these deep partnerships, again, is something where our incentives are aligned. It means that your work has an impact. I think co-creation isn't just co-creation of research, but co-creation of advocacy. And so providing spaces to elevate academics, because often practitioners have more access to those spaces. But last, to think back to this life cycle point, when I envision the opportunities later in the professional life cycle, I think about the needs of how the academic institution needs to change, and how I see some of those things changing even now. For example, at a place like Stanford, in the last 5 years, we've seen the launch of a set of institutions meant to form what are called impact labs with the core focus of creating tractable social change on the ground through partnered research. I've seen the creation of professorships that are called professors of social impact, which are, again, focused on building collaboration and taking away the ivory tower approach to academia. And so I think some of this is also a longer term shift that has to happen within academic institutions to value the kinds of partnered research and dialogue that we're discussing here. And that's something that hopefully we can, building more of this work and showing its value for the world, will continue to enable and allow change.
Vikram, can I add one more point here? It's a very quick.
Yes, sir, of course.
One, I will not quote, but I think once I wrote for an NGO initiative, which was published. What I'm coming to a point, many development sector, which I'm sure Anis Bhai and many will other agree, have a very, very tedious task to prove they are worthy of it with the donors. And if any publication on the work of the NGO, actually, if you see, drastically improves the acceptability as far as the performance and the ability of the NGO to do whatever they want to actually suggest. My thinking is that if you look at many development sector working on ground, if there is an initiative which allows young professionals also to document, which is published in a reputed, maybe mainstream journal, I'm not talking about very specialized journal in terms of what we have, let's say, on these sectors and subjects, that actually improves the ability of the NGOs also. At the same time, if you look at some may not be a very authentic data. Once I was there and I was told that in last 10 years, there are approximately 45,500 PhDs in social science in India in 1 decade. Now, if you see this research scholars, they may be very happy if there is a platform which provides them to go and study, if there is some mapping done. Because, social science PhD, like when we did our PhD, we cannot actually afford to write a PhD unless until we are there for 1 year in the village. So what I think, that can be a good opportunity for converging the interest of PhD scholars with creating a right platform. Let's say I want to do PhD in social inclusion in India, or so which is the NGO where I should go and actually work upon? Because finding a problem will not elevate any kind of my respect. I have to search for alternatives, may not be a solution. So where is that? There were some long back, if you remember, I think some NGO, one or two directories were there, but those directories are now draconian. They have got no use. So something can be done which can bring contemporary topical knowledge, whether it is an experiment also, and converge these two.
Excellent idea, sir.
Very interesting suggestion.
We'll work on this.
All right, as we're getting close to time, let's start with our Q&As, of which we have two at the moment. The first one from Lavina asks, what do we mean by incentives when we talk about practitioners? We've talked a lot about academic incentives. What could practitioner incentives look like? And I'll just add, abusing my moderator privileges, this kind of a sub point here, especially thinking about practitioners who might be in, in honestly where the money is today, in consulting companies, perhaps in donor-funded development organizations, perhaps in large public policy wings of big corporations, or perhaps sustainability positions in corporations which are becoming more common. So perhaps a lot of our audience will find themselves at some point in these positions as well. So how does one think about incentives for these practitioners, and how one can still be a public policy professional when you have these incentives?
I think, Sole, if you could expand on the practitioner incentives, because you have looked at, for both your research, you have deeply embedded practitioners and you have excited them on your work. So
I'm happy to speak on this, though. Anish, please jump in if and when I get some of this wrong. But I think it's important to get to the core of it, because most of the people working in this space, whatever field you're in, whether you're working from academia, whether you're working from practice, whether you're working from one of the kinds of consultancies that you mentioned, Vikram, everyone is passionate about solving the social problem. And yet, at the end of the day, rarely are our jobs incentivized by, if you make traction on a problem, then you have achieved something. The incentives are hopefully aligned towards that. For example, the goal would be that more publications means more learning, which means more traction on a social problem. But that's a very indirect pathway to solution. And so the academic is, operates through that pathway. I think a lot of practitioners, the indirect pathway there is, well, what are the incentives? You have to keep your doors open as an organization. You have to keep your staff hired. You have to be able to raise funding to do implementation. And so that's a core incentive. And so then we need to think about, what are the incentives to fundraising? I think another incentive is you have to be able to actually operate on the ground and feasibly integrate within both a political landscape and a bureaucratic landscape that exists, which means you face a set of constraints on what kinds of policies you might even be able to implement and attempt to apply. And so those are both, I think, an important set of incentives that an academic can't just come and say, I have this idea, we should try some implementation. But if it's politically infeasible, or if it requires a bureaucratic system that's not possible, or if there's no funding to do so, that's going to make it impossible for an implementer to do that. And so what that means is that from the practice side, we have to think about, what are the incentives of funders? What are the incentives of politicians? What are the incentives of policymakers and integration? And so when I say incentive compatible, often it's, how do we think about how we bring all of these incentives together? And of course, within all of this, there are power hierarchies. Some people's incentives matter more because they have veto power over what can and can't be implemented. And so that inherently limits the scope of things. And so all of this creates a more narrow set of opportunities, which could be seen as a challenge, but also possibly provides usefulness in helping us pinpoint where partnership can actually happen. And that there's feasibility constraints, there's there's incentive constraints on both sides. And maybe the last thing just to say on this, and I'm happy to expand more if there are follow-up questions, but in this role of the consultants and others coming into this profession, trying to fill other gaps, or what may be seen at times as competing with the kinds of learnings that academics might bring to the table. I think what's important in all of this is to identify the different incentives. The consultants' incentives are different from academics. They're not to produce publications, where the average publication, at least in my field, takes 2 to 3 years just from the moment you have a paper written to getting it like in print on the page, let alone the number of years. I mean, I have so many projects that have taken a decade to get from ideation to print publication. That's not something that's true for consultants, but they may be more constrained by what can fund the work that they're doing, the financial constraints. The beauty of academia is that we are not financially motivated to work on some things, except in that we need publications to keep our jobs. And so what all of this to me suggests, or at least boils down to, is everyone has a different set of incentives, and acknowledging those is important, but also bring something different to the table. And so if a practitioner organization needs rapid information on specific things that's compatible with what a consultant can do, that I think is an opportunity to develop a different kind of collaboration. Whereas if the goal is long run sort of deep learning, potentially in a more theoretical way, that can have maybe a larger impact, that might be the space where these larger and deeper collaborations with universities and academics falls into place. I'm sure there's a lot more nuance to that, but really just thinking about what are the constraints, but also what are the opportunities of different forms of partnerships, and figuring out where those align. I promise, I really do believe there are alignments, even though it may feel like there aren't, but we often don't talk about it. And so it means that the only things that bubble up are the things where either power forces it to happen, or where you have the just beautiful synergy that emerges naturally. And so to me, it's really about communication. And the more we can talk about this, and be explicit about what those constraints are, the better we'll be able to identify the opportunity points.
If I can say, what I understood best, of course, the one which is already said, how do we categorize as a strategy of incentives? To best of my knowledge, I found Olson's work of logic of collective action as where he categorizes into material or physical incentives. Could be job, scholarship, or article, all these factors. The second one he says is that it's very critical to bring in purposive incentives, that what I'm doing good about society, maybe also. And the third one is more like a membership incentive that is called, in his term, is solidarity incentives. Like solidarity is membership incentives. If I'm part of TRI, or if I'm doing PhD in association with TRI, I get authentic information and so forth. So basically, incentives largely can be categorized into three, that is material or physical incentives, purposive incentives, and solidarity incentives. That is how, and everybody has a permutation combination of it based on age and stage of their work.
Those are both super interesting. In the interest of time, I'm just going to move on to the last question, which is sufficiently broad to warrant a panel discussion all by itself. So, but it's going to be, I'm going to challenge our panelists to give 2-minute answers to what I think is a very complicated question. An anonymous attendee asks, how can policies be effectively implemented in a system which doesn't have enough capacity to handle the complexities on the ground? It's a little outside the scope of this discussion, but I think very relevant since we've been talking about many of the themes and natural question which emerges. So any of our panelists wants to take a go at this in the next 5 minutes?
It's such a broad topic, but my thinking is that to classify as successful or unsuccessful is not a good categorization. One has to look at the degree and form of unsuccessfulness and successfulness in terms of how it has achieved whatever it is desired. Now, in this term, what I also believe is that somewhere the learnings of failures are not articulated well in order to make changes in the policy failures. If you read policy failures literature, it's very minimal, and there is no literature in India which I could find out. I was trying to study this area of policy failure, that what are the analysis of policy failure. It's very rare. It's hardly there in India. I personally believe it's a very good area of opportunity which one has raised for all the academicians and development sector to come together and understand the fundamentals basically which can be designed as policy failure. We did some work with one of my PhD scholar on regulatory failure, but not as policy failure. So I think time is less, but we can take it further later.
So Vikram, and this is, as you rightly said, it is a topic by itself for a longish conversation. Our experience at TRI in the last 6-7 years, we have been, very pleasantly surprised with what one can achieve in this space. And it is, multiple factors we contributed to it, and we have learned a lot today. And as we speak, one of our practice vertical is called Public Policy in Action, and some of the audience today is part of cohort of practice residency that we run. There is a few colleagues from the fellowship, and we have today now 72 units working within the government at central, state, and district levels. And I would tell, I keep telling my colleagues of working on the ground for 24 years and what we have achieved in the 6-7 years. In terms of the sheer impact, and as Avinash was saying, there is, we as NGOs, and we have suffered on the moral side, Avinash, people with the million billions that we keep talking about. And as you say, we just have, thereafter we are launching with Ministry of Rural Development, a program of million designers for billion dreams, where we are envisaging in each of our 600 or 1,000 villages, creating community-based design professionals. And so in some ways, we, while on the other side of, the tyranny of million billions that we have in our country, but there is, unmistakable and imperative to work at a scale, speed, expand, on the scope, given the challenges that we have in our country. And I would affirm, one could always look at the glass half full, but if one were to look at glass, half full in terms of looking at the opportunities there, I think there is enormous opportunity. And at TRI, we have gained immense confidence in working with the system. I would not comment on the competencies, but I must tell you that as a country, we have achieved phenomenally we have achieved, and in spite of everything, and that famous Galbraith's quote is there for our country. But this is something that we need today, and there is a much more acceptance of this. The spaces that Vikram, you alluded to in the opening statement that the consultants are occupying, this is for people like us with deeper commitment on purpose to engaging, and that is opening up rapidly, and we must seize the opportunity as it presents itself.
All right, that was a very, very enriching discussion overall. We heard a lot about the importance of dialogue and how different perspectives can start us to learn more about the world and what we can do about it. And I think this panel discussion was a great example. If anybody is skeptical about the power of dialogue, because we had so many different perspectives emerge, and we also have concrete suggestions which have and people who have promised to take them forward. I can't think of a higher measure of success for a panel discussion than that. But just to risk a brief summary of the points made by everybody, I think we heard a lot about dialogue, the importance of it, the orientation which individuals should have of humility and acknowledging the strengths of each other while entering in the dialogues, and also a strong acknowledgement of the challenges faced by different incentives based on where people are in their institutions as well as in the stage of their careers. And nevertheless, a call to see this as an opportunity, that to perceive these different sets of incentives not as constraints which bind you, but more, I think, as perspectives which people bring to the table, and where perhaps these incentives overlap, there you see the opportunity to actually bring lots of people together and make change. We also had very useful suggestions about how one could tackle some of these problems, which often show up when academics and practitioners work together. We heard what you can do about your different timelines in terms of working with PhD students, or structuring your outputs differently to serve the needs of both research and practice. We heard about how one can kind of try and bridge the gap between the essential simplicity which research demands and the complexity which is essential in the field. And we also heard a call to understand that the strains are different on different partners, and to approach that with a kind of empathy and understanding. And I think most interestingly, we heard a call to oneself as well, which I think as just individuals in this field, whether we're in academia or politics or wherever else we might be, to kind of the first time I was hearing this phrase of accountability to oneself, your own ability to justify the choices you're making and live with those choices you're making, and how important that is as a foundation which underpins your ability to actually have meaningful dialogue with different people. So we heard a lot of different suggestions, and this is of course a conversation which, just as all the panelists asked for, which will not end here, which will hopefully keep continuing in different forums and with different stakeholders and with different at different times. So thank you so much to all our panelists, to Mr. Anish, Professor Anish, and Professor Sole. It's been lovely moderating this discussion between you. Thanks so much to the organizers, TRIF, Shruti, and the technical team, and of course to all our participants who listened in and asked questions.
Thank you so much, Srinivas. It was lovely. You connected us, weaved us all in such a fluid manner. Thank you so much. Thank you, Avinash, and thank you, Sole.
Thanks to everyone. So lovely to
Bye
be
bye.
part.
Bye bye. See you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.